Welcome to another Mathematic webinar. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here for what I know is going to be an outstanding program. I am Rachel Robinson, Vice President at Mathematic, and it's a good to see all of you again. So before we get started, I just want to say a quick thank you to Greenberg Traurig and Claripath for putting this outstanding program together. This is something that I know is top of mind for a lot of companies. Obviously, robotics is a huge opportunity in medtech, and we're seeing more and more, not only adoption, but investment in this particular area. And as we do, obviously, there are a lot of things that need to be considered, IP being, one at the forefront of many conversations. How do you strategize? How do you protect yourself? And how do you set yourself up for success? So I'm absolutely thrilled to turn this over to Dave Dykman, who is a fantastic partner of ours, and his associates to kick things off.
So thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Mathematic, for this opportunity. My name is Dave Dykman. I'm a patent attorney at Greenberg Traurig, where I also co-chair our life science and medical technology practice. I've been on the board of Mathematic for 6 years and then some now, so I'm a big believer in the organization and really impressed with how Brian Johnson and Rachel Robinson have really led Mathematic to really raise its profile during the pandemic, and certainly these webinars are part of it. And I think part of that is, we saw the registration list. We've got people from all over the United States, just not in Boston and Massachusetts, which I think is great because medical device innovation knows no bounds. And today we're going to talk about kind of the next revolution that's already begun in medicine. We're going to talk about medical robotics. And we've got some great panelists to do that today. And, I'll start out. So I've got two of my colleagues with me and then two people from Claripath. We are lawyers at Greenberg, a global law firm. We've got a strong Boston office. And co-chairing. We've got 40 locations around the world, 11 countries, 2,200 lawyers. Medical technology is a very important part of our firm. We work with a lot of VCs, a lot of large publicly traded medical device companies, commercial stage, early stage, helping map out the IP strategy. FDA regulatory, product liability, avoid litigation. If you do get involved in litigation, we've got some great litigators. So we really represent life science companies through their whole life cycle. We work with a lot of VC and private equity firms on doing deals, whether it's due diligence for VC investment, later stage private equity takeouts or roll-ups, mergers, licenses, working with research institutions as well. So we've gotten a lot of accolades for our work in the life sciences, and we want to continue to build on that. And we've got a great panel today to talk to you about medical robotics. And when we talk about medical robotics, really a broadest possible definition. Obviously, robotic surgery is what gets many of the headlines and is what people initially think about. And certainly the robotic OR, will be the surgical room of the future. But there's also many other areas which are ripe for innovation and for strokes, heart attacks, broken bones, walking. We also seen another area for robotic needle insertion and blood draws, and even for trying to give robotic vaccinations and shots. We all know is also important now. And seeing robotic manufacturing, medical device continually in every area.
Hey, Dave,
and I think today
Dave, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Your internet's a bit choppy. Can I suggest turning off your video?
Sure.
Thank you.
So apologies for that. Hopefully this is better.
Sounds better for now. I'll let you know if it goes out again.
Okay. We're going to talk about a lot of medical innovation. You know, we're really lucky to have two speakers from Claripath here today. And, you know, they're showing us the way. We've got Dr. Partha Mitra, who's one of the founders of Claripath. When he founded the company in 2014 as a spin out from Cold Springs Harbor Laboratories, where he's got an appointment. And we're also fortunate to have CEO Eric Feinstein, who's leading the company to commercialize the really revolutionary platform for laboratory. They're, as Claripath will tell us, they're creating, you know, they're automating the last remaining manual process for histopathology and really helping create the laboratory, medical laboratory of the future. So along with them, we have, you know, patent attorneys and my colleagues, Todd Basil and Roman Feierberg, who specialize in medical robotics. Todd has a background working in automation at Bell Helicopters prior to becoming an attorney. And Roman was an R&D engineer at Boston Scientific and Bard before becoming a patent attorney. But I think with that, we'd love to hear the Claripath story. And we'll turn it over to CEO Eric Feinstein to tell us a little bit about the company and how they're going to revolutionize histopathology laboratories.
Thank you, David. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all a little bit about our story. I'll try to keep the background on Claripath brief, but in a nutshell, what are we doing? We've got an instrument, a robotic instrument that has roughly 30 different subsystems that are all packaged together that have optics and mechanical systems, as well as software that, again, are all packaged together into a box that mimics what a human does today. That process hasn't changed in about 100 years. The laboratory medicine, and we all experience this as patients and you know, getting biopsies and then the interpretation of those results. Most of what occurs in the laboratory is really kind of unseen to a few folks, except for laboratory equipment companies and really pathologists and lab directors. Other than that, no one really knows what goes on. So we've tried to bring some light to a very large problem in not just in the U.S. but a worldwide problem. There's a severe labor shortage within the laboratory space. It takes a very special person to be able to cut tissue at the micron level. So we cut at about 4 microns, which is a fraction of a human hair. We cut these very thin cross sections of tissue that then move on for a pathologist to diagnose. Does that person have cancer or do they not? We're taking very fine motor skills, things like looking at the tissue and cognitive processing and decision making. We're taking all of that, plus these mechanical motor skills of moving something from point A to point B, and again, packaging it all together into a smart robot. So we have a couple of aspects to the Claripath company. We have a device, a fully automated device that is akin to, and our advisors like to say this, it's akin to the Mars rover. You know, except we're not going to a hostile environment, and we're here domestically in the laboratory of hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. We have again this device that is for the pharmaceutical and contract research organization space, and then we have a clinical FDA cleared device that is for hospitals, ambulatory surgery centers, and physician practice groups. We have another aspect to the Claripath company. We have a laboratory services and contract research organization where we process human and animal tissue in our New York laboratory. Let me pause there. And Partha, would you like to add any introductory remarks on the Claripath system?
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, I hear an echo. So thank you for asking me and us to present here. I guess the one thing that I will say is that we have looked very carefully at a realistic change to the current technology. So there's a lot of great research out there, and I'm doing fundamental scientific research, but transforming medicine is yet another story. So we've been very careful to pick a place where the robotic automation can, in fact, take the next step while keeping the fit to all the other steps that are there in the current laboratory. And this has been an interesting challenge from a robotics perspective, because what we are doing is, in some sense, next generation robotics. The previous medical automation or devices in this space, in some sense, it belonged to the pre-smart car era. And what we are doing is, squarely in the smart car or automated driving era. So there is a new version of robotics, essentially, that we are trying to bring to laboratory medicine, incrementally, but profoundly, I hope, transforming the space.
Thank you, Partha. David, one of the aspects that I did want to address, given that the whole webinar is about intellectual property, and we can touch on this as we go, throughout our conversation, is the real need to advance our intellectual property from both an offensive and defensive standpoint. And I'll be honest, before I came into ClariPath and automation in particular, this is a very complicated space. There's quite a bit of prior art. Navigating that is a complicated endeavor. Again, when you have 30 different subsystems that are all packaged together mechanically, optically, and then with software, you start to run into lots of different industries. And always in the back of my mind is freedom to operate. And so our engineers, and one of the reasons why, and we can talk a little bit about this throughout the webinar, one of the reasons why we, quote, professionalized our intellectual property and patent firm to Greenberg Traurig was really the backgrounds of the attorneys. So, Roman, Todd, David, having a background in automation in particular, and in operations, and sort of being in the trenches adds a whole new layer of understanding to a very, very complicated set in space in which we're operating in.
Maybe one thing I will add is that we are in this unique situation where we are doing something that is in the medical space and also in the tech space. We are doing robotics, and we are trying to do cutting edge robotics, and we are doing it in the medical space. And that kind of cross-disciplinary work is both challenging and exciting, and definitely brings up the importance of proper IP protection.
No, and I think that's a great point. And we've been working with ClariPath for a few years. And I think some of the lessons we've learned with ClariPath are universal, and can be applied to early stage companies and to later stage companies. And we're going to walk through some of those lessons today and hear from the experts, both on the company side and on the legal side. And I think we've touched on a lot of these already. Like what's the importance of IP? I think Eric and Partha talked about that. It protects your investment, it deters competitors, establishes value, helps obtain financing for VCs, and helps on your acquisition value. Certainly having a proprietary and patented product helps in advertising, and it certainly helps to leverage in lawsuits, both offensive and defenses, as Eric mentioned. If people are reluctant to sue someone, only the lawyers win those battles. But why don't we open up to the panel, and And maybe Eric, you can talk about the first point, the evolution of a startup company and how do you establish a culture of innovation. And then we can hear from Roman and Todd about kind of scope of coverage and some filing strategies.
Sure. So thank you. And I've been involved in a number of startups throughout the years as both a venture investor, an operator, and ClariPath was a really unique one. It certainly had the complexity and nichiness of a market that I'd never really seen before. We had this unbelievable market opportunity that, and I mean this most sincerely, has not changed in about 100 years. There were very large lab equipment med tech players that have dominated this space. And outside of those players really innovating, there hasn't been a lot of activity. And the box that we have been creating, again, has been sort of in flux for the last 100 years. And when we looked at that market opportunity, we also looked at some of the prior art in the space, and it was very clear that the 800-pound gorillas had quite a bit of it locked up in a manual process. But what they didn't have was how do we take that to the next level, and how do we think about automation and taking that automation into sort of the next chapter in the next 100 years. And we had, and I had seen this at other startups. You're constrained. You have constraints. You have employee constraints. You have financing constraints. Intellectual property usually starts early on with a founder like Dr. Mitra and some early intellectual property coming out. And then, maybe there's one patent, two patents that get written over a course of a year, 2 years. There's some folks that like to put a tremendous emphasis on intellectual property while leaving sort of the other aspects to growing a business behind. And then, I've seen the other side of the pendulum where there's very little intellectual property and everything focused on the other side. There has to be, and from my perspective in a startup, there has to be a unique and a balance between early patent writings that are defensible, and they don't always have to be broad. They can be very specific and targeted if it builds competitive advantage, for that particular marketplace. And when we thought about some of the early patents that ClariPath wrote, it started to look at a holistic view of our platform, but then there were some very future-oriented patents that were written and were eventually granted. And only as we got into sort of the later stages of our business, after we attracted significant equity funding and the team started to grow, we really had this mindset of how do we protect ourselves, both defensively, but then also let's be a major player in this space. The 800-pound gorillas have dominated it. Let's go in and build for the next 100 years. That will help us. That'll help us from an offensive standpoint. And it was only then that we started to dive into some very detailed engineering. And Roman kind of went through this during his Boston Scientific Days and R&D. You start to get, very detailed into the nuances of, the types of materials. And when you deal with a micron scale, those things matter. And seemingly those things have been completely glossed over. That was sort of deep in the weeds, and we started writing patents on those specific things. And then there was the other side to the pendulum where very basic things around automation, sort of the Achilles heel. If you want something to be fully automated, you have to do certain things. And this could be, in our case, changing blades. Sounds so simple, but a human does that today. But there was no automated system that changed blades. And so when you start to layer these aspects together, from very complicated and very niche and detailed, all the way to very simple things like low-hanging fruit. You start to build a collection and a portfolio for defensive and offensive purposes. And then finally, it was only until we had I'd say equity funding. We had folks that came in on the venture side that helped really build a culture of growth, and that's important. It's important to each individual engineering employee, as well as our board and how we think about our strategy and everything that we do. Let me pause there. And Partha, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, one, I guess, pragmatic thing that's worth saying is that when the company started in 2014, I worked with individual attorneys who, one individual attorney in particular, whom I knew through a very close colleague. And obviously, we didn't have funds to hire a firm like Greenberg Traurig at that point. So the initial patents were written. I think we're written well. David, Roman, you may want to comment on that. But then, and we had a second attorney as well. We had to be very cost conscious during these times when we were raising some money, and yet had to file patents. We did file patents from the very first day. But then once we had enough money, then we did feel the need to both broaden our portfolio, bring in a kind of a real firm, so to speak. So that's the practical life of the startup, I suppose. That's something that did happen to us.
And Todd or Roman, why don't one of you comment on some of your experience working with the early stage companies space? Todd, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Todd Basil, I'm down here in our Dallas office at Greenberg Traurig. As a younger patent attorney here, who's been in industry for a while, as well as practicing out here in the legal field, worked with many early stage companies, and I think Eric hit the nail on the head. It's you're either getting one extreme or the other in terms of all in on IP, or we'll worry about that later. And I've found that the circumstances are different for every single company, and it's extremely important to understand where a company is at, where its technology is at, where its funding is at, where its industry is at, and where its goals are going, and then tailoring a strategy to that. There's many one size fits all type folks out there, and that there's merit to that in some respects, but me personally, I like to view myself as a partner with the business, and ask those questions and really tailor something that's going to provide the most ROI for where the company is at that point, and help them accomplish what they want to accomplish. Sometimes the goal is attract funding, and there's a way you might position an IP portfolio to do that. Sometimes it's to attract partnerships within the industry or other players, and you might position your IP in a different way for that, and come up with strategies for how you're going to leverage those and commercialize those to grow the business. So my one point would be, it's different for everyone. Identify those things and work hard to tailor your strategy to those specific circumstances, and you will have a much higher chance of success being the way that you define it for your company at that time.
Yeah, Todd, just one quick comment. That's a really important point, because that customization of what success really looks like. Is it building a portfolio of IP to license out to a major med tech, or is it growing a sustainable business that you can then attract funding, go on, continue to grow, potentially go, public offering process. They sound the same, but they're very different. And what you do in the early years affects what happens down the road. And that's something, and this is an investment. I mean, plain and simple. Partha and I have talked about this extensively. It's not inexpensive to go down and build a strong patent portfolio. There's an opportunity cost of our engineers' time to write this and our employees' time, but then a real hard cost of dollars. And it's an investment in our future. And that's really important because we are in this for long-term growth, not just building a portfolio to license out to somebody.
Yeah, Eric, I think you bring a very unique perspective to it as well. You mentioned earlier that you've been on the investor side and you've been on the startup side, and you know what it is that folks are looking for when evaluating your company with that investor experience. I mean, I do probably a dozen M&A deals every year with tech companies, and most of them are on the buyer or the investor side. And so hardly a day goes by where I'm not looking at the IP assets of a company, whether it's patents, whether it's their trade secrets, their software, or what have you, and really viewing how that's going to fit into the future path of the company, into the goals of the investor and what they can bring to the table and where they want to take the company. And so, there's you hit the nail on the head. It's the value of an IP portfolio is in the eyes of a beholder, whether that's a competitor, whether that's an investor, whether that's a partner, and you got to tailor it to that.
And it takes time.
And I think it's very important, as you guys mentioned, you have to work close with attorneys to kind of come up with the strategy that fits your stage, fits your goals, the patent coverage strategy. For example, obviously the larger companies have more funds and they can cover, they can file more patent application versus a earlier stage company. It's important to understand kind of what makes your device work the best. And yes, you can start with, you write the patent applications that highlight those advantages, but also maybe go broader. And if your goal is to first defensively protect your device, you can start with a little bit maybe narrower, stronger claims. You protect your device, and then you come back with continuation applications, trying to be more offensive and trying to build kind of that fence, that another layer of protection around your technology. Then, sometimes it's hard, right? Sometimes it's hard. You kind of have to look into the future and kind of think like where we're going to go with this technology. But the best applications that are written are, you have to go through the work and understand where we're now and what can be, where would we want to go. And that's kind of gives you the opportunities to keep filing the continuation applications and build that protection around the technology, and hopefully stop others from, be on the offense if you have to, stop others from repeating this.
If I may jump in, there's a question that came up that's relevant, I think, to what we are talking about. Obviously was at the top of my mind as well. How many patents do I file? How do I get the strongest patent? How can I file one patent that kind of rules them all? We have a very complex device, so we are filing many patents. But maybe there is something about our process that may be interesting to people. It is kind of teamwork. We are lucky enough to have one of the members of our board, very astute and written lots of patents. And I think we had to undergo a little bit of learning as to what makes a good patent. Roman and David also helped us understand that, how to write the claim sets. And this interactive dialogue, especially with one or two really seasoned people, may be critical to writing good patents. And it's, I won't speak to how many patents you need, that may depend on the application, but how you write good patents is a process. And one nugget from my point of view is, hierarchical approach. So what's the big idea? can it be protected? What are the minimal number of steps that you can execute the idea through to protect it? That process was important for us. And then the number of patents is really driven by the complexity. I don't know, Roman, David, any comments?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I guess as I mentioned, the cost is obviously preparing the applications and the filing cost and things like that. So you do want your applications to be as detailed as possible, and that each application can, over time result in a number of patents. So instead of, again, depending where the technology goes, depending, how much detail and how much different inventions you put in. So it's very, sometimes it's not just a number of patents, it's obviously the quality, but also, if you put the work up front in each application over time can provide you additional patents. And that's, as I said, you may start with kind of the hierarchical approach. You start with maybe narrower claims, especially if it's an earlier stage company, to start getting patents issued. You start with narrow claims, and then you come back and file continuation divisional application to start expanding that scope of coverage that's provided by the claims.
Roman, one thing that I would add, and this is from a CEO that looks at an engineering team, and I'd like to hear Todd and Roman, your perspective here. This sounds so obvious, but I'd say to a lot of our engineers, it actually wasn't an obvious thing to do. When you look at a complicated device, and I think for earlier stage companies, I think this is even more important because we talk about the quality of that patent versus the volume of patents. You have to know the prior art in the space, and you should be reading the patents of all of your other competitors out there, not the patent attorneys, but you as an inventor, as an early company individual. Engineers should understand what that landscape looks at. You cannot effectively write a good patent, and you certainly don't want to infringe. So you better have a really good idea, and you should know what the landscape looks like. You don't want to write a patent that is going to be denied because there's time and money that it costs to execute that. And so as founders, as early employees, everyone should have a really good understanding of what the landscape looks like. And that's not an obvious thing for a lot of folks. People just sort of say, I have an idea, and I'd love to hear Todd and Roman's perspective here. I have an idea. Is this patentable, or should I write a patent on this? That should be up to the founder, or the early employees. I shouldn't say just the founder. It's really the early employees.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of advantages of understanding the landscape, both from two perspectives. One, from the perspective of the company, because you also, it's not just patenting. You don't want to build a device that is going to infringe. And sometimes you might not have a choice, but especially if you start early, there may be opportunity to design around and avoid these patents. And obviously, from the perspective of how you file and what you claim, it's important to understand the landscape because, again, it's an expensive process, and you do want to have meaningful claims that are, commercially valuable claims. And sometimes you can get a patent with very narrow claims, but, if they're not commercially valuable, you don't want to go through the process. So the landscape is very important. And it's very important. And, that being said, it's also expensive, especially in a crowded field. It's very expensive to do all the searches, and sometimes you have to kind of figure out that balance, of how much money you spend on researching the landscape, or maybe you do go and file the patent application and then kind of spend that money on filing the patent application, have the USPTO do the landscapes, do their prior art searches, and that kind of gives you the relevant prior art. So as we were talking about, I think it really depends on, where you are, like what, if this is a crowded, litigious technical field, you might want to spend the money up front. If it's something less crowded or kind of a newer direction, then, you might want to wait on that. But as I said, it's definitely something that, each company needs to decide what works, best for that company. Because again, it is expensive. And for a lot of earlier stage companies, it might be very expensive to do like a really comprehensive landscape search.
Yeah.
And Roman, just to clarify, we had, oh, sorry, Todd, just to clarify, we actually took all of our employees during a 2-week period, and we said that that's all they were doing was landscaping, effectively doing an internal FPO. And that was something I literally said, every one of our engineers, you're searching and you're trying to understand landscape. You're going to read, and for 2 weeks, that's all they did.
Yeah, no, I've seen that, and it's definitely very valuable. And kind of another thing to add is it's expensive, but there are ways around it. Either, if you have sophisticated technical personnel, they can help, or, there are other ways, maybe just kind of understanding who the competitors are, search them. But as I said, there's a lot of value in understanding what your landscape is from the development perspective, as well as the kind of the filing perspective.
And one thing to add to that is when you find something that seems like it is running into your space, how to work around it, if one may put it this way. There are many ways of skinning a cat. And it is, of course, one wants to write a patent that you cannot circumvent. On the other hand, you encounter a patent and you say that I need freedom to operate. Is there a different way of doing it? So the alternative, understanding the alternatives, I think is very critical from both perspectives, both because you want to have freedom to operate and you want to understand the alternatives. And when you write a patent, you want to block off the alternatives. And I think it is a very interesting exercise, deepens your understanding of the system because you then understand the different designs. You understand what's fundamental to the design, what's optional. So this landscape search, it really is about understanding the multiple universes in which your invention could live and the multiple design choices. And that is, I think, fundamental both to writing the patent and to inventing.
I'd add one extra thing to that, and Partha, that is so spot on. There's the FTO search perspective. Hey, am I infringing on someone else's stuff? And then there's the, hey, how can I increase my chances of getting a patent on this technology? And I'll speak on the latter. I am a huge fan of prior art searches, patentability searches, which can be much more focused and cost effective before putting pen to paper on an invention, unless of course, the inventors are really truly know the landscape already and can speak to it. The reason being is once you draft a patent application and file it, it's set in stone. You can't go back and supplement it. You might be able to file a follow-on application for something new and novel that you came up with afterwards. But once you file, that's it. And that's the ammunition you have to fight your battle with at the patent office. Now, if you can do some recon of the battlefield in advance, understand where the traps are, where the ambush points are, where just, hey, the minefield, we got a path right here. We certainly don't want to go over here. If you know that in advance, you can draft the application in a way that really enhances your strengths. And, I found that A, that vastly improves your chances of getting a patent, and B, it actually makes things a lot more cost efficient. A little bit of money up front for that intel can often pay off down the road because you might get that first office action allowance, or you might only have to negotiate once with the examiner to get your claims across the goal line, versus if you're going in blind and you're trying to come up with creative stuff based on some ambiguous disclosure you have in your application, you're in for quite the fight, and it's going to cost you more, and the ultimate end product might not be as strong as it would be otherwise. So my 2 cents, big fan of knowing what you're knowing what's out there when you go into the patent filing process.
And maybe I'll add something specific to robotics, because we are living in an era of rapid change in, people say artificial intelligence, robotics, all these different words. Of course, there's a whole continuum that has been going on for a while. I would say, modern technologies, automation has been evolving. So how to write effective patents or in the robotics space requires, I think, multidisciplinary knowledge and creative thinking about the problem, and becomes an integral part of the inventing process itself. So that's maybe particularly interesting. There may be other cases where you have one key patent and then there's a point when you write it and you move on. Here, it's a continuous evolution that we are seeing, because it is a moving, robotics is a moving field. There's software, there's hardware, how those things play together. There's electrical, optics, all these, in some sense, different aspects of the human organism that we are trying to replicate. And I think there is a nice interplay between the invention process and the filing process.
And we have, Partha, just to further that one point, we've got a cross-functional team at Claripath. We have a chemical engineer, a systems engineer, mechanical engineers, software engineers, electrical engineers. Partha, a theoretical physicist by background. You layer all of these different disciplines together, and you along with our patent attorneys. So we've done a lot of work prior to coming to our patent attorneys, and you create, Partha hit something really important. It's the essence. What is the essence of what you're trying to convey, the idea, and it's distilling it down. And engineers, I found, have a way and a habit of making things far more complicated than they really need to be. If you really try to pin down what are the 3 to 5 most salient points of this invention, what is it? It's a very hard thing to do, and something that we work quite a bit on when we write patents, and then hopefully before we turn that over to our IP firm.
Yeah, and Eric, that's that's such an important thing to consider too, and it's often a reason why we, as patent attorneys, some do it a different way, but we often start with drafting a claim set before we even put pen to paper on the technical write-up, because doing that forces you to identify what's important at its most basic level, and what is more supporting cast, because the claims are the distillation of the broadest description of that invention you can get based on what's already out there. It's a forced outline, it's a forced process, and working hand in hand with your patent attorneys to do that up front with the claims is an excellent way to get to that point, if not already done internally.
Yeah, and I want to also say, and we try to build our teams to replicate the same, have the attorneys from different disciplines. For example, my background is in chemical engineering and then biomedical engineering. Todd is more mechanical automation guy, and we have computer, because in the robotics there's so many different disciplines. Even when we work with Claripath, as you mentioned, we file patents on the hydration system with chemical engineering, some kind of more software patents, some more just purely mechanical patents. And it is important to find, as you said, your patents, you asked that earlier part. The patents that were drafted earlier, they're good patents. I think you got really good claims to cover those kind of early fundamental concepts. But as you continue building the device, as your R&D develops, it is important to have that kind of attorney team that has different backgrounds, different disciplines.
There was a question that came up and I typed out an answer. I think it was a good question. Collaborative robots are independent. We actually have an army of robots inside a box. In some sense, we're working very closely together. And whether a human is involved and how the robot behaves differently or similarly as a human, we are building a fully automated system. And one of the interesting points is, of course, robots are not constrained to be humans. So they can do things in different ways. You can automate in different ways. So we are definitely trying to exploit that. And, I mean, I think that this is also fun. There is that aspect. Todd says that software and data should be covered, and I agree. I think one of the key issues that certainly we encounter is, the robot has a brain. It is software that really ultimately drives the behavior of the robot and the smartness of the robot. How do you protect that? That's really a key question. Roman, I don't know.
I'd ask the attorneys to comment. That's a complicated one. As an investor, I've seen countless things in countless companies and software that, frankly, it's just very difficult. So I'd love to hear the attorneys.
Yeah, maybe I'll take an initial stab.
Yeah, you start, Todd.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something I come across with the M&A deals I mentioned all the time. I mean, this has been a patent-heavy conversation, and rightly so, because the medical device industry and the robotics industries, there's a lot of value in patents in those spaces. A lot of things can be easily reverse engineered, and so you need that sort of protection. You can't really protect it as a trade secret in some respects. But when you get over into fields like software and data and know-how, I mean, those can be equally valuable and important to a company, if not more so, than a lot of what's could be put out there in a patent. And so maybe we'll carve these up one by one, but the key areas that I think should be focused on are here on the slide. I mean, ownership, license rights and control, legal compliance, and practical protections. These are all non-patent protections. And there really is a lot of concrete ways you can protect the value of that intellectual property, the software, the data, the know-how, without going down the patent road. Sometimes patents don't make sense. Sometimes you can't even get them. Some software you're not even allowed to patent. And so, you really want to consider the ways that you can protect these things. If we could go to the next slide, Dave. Okay, while that's pulling up, on the software front, and this is near and dear to my heart. One of the most important things to look at, and I'm saying this from the perspective of someone who picks apart, potential companies that are being acquired, their intellectual property all the time, is really a focus on ownership, right? And you'd think, look, it's very intuitive. My people developed it, or I hired this third party developer to code up the software. It's very intuitive. Look, that's mine. I'm paying them. It's mine. I own it. Well, in the real world, it's not always so black and white, cut and dry. There is some state law and this and that sort of might suggest that, but it varies from place to place. And places like California are a little more, inventor friendly, if you will, compared to company friendly. And so, the one thing I would stress on that front is memorialize your ownership in your agreement. You should have an agreement in place anyways, with whether it's employees, an employment agreement, or whether it's with, an outsourced developer or something of that nature, governing the relationship. And one of the things that should be in there is acknowledgement of ownership, as well as an IP assignment. Hey, whatever you code up for me, Mr. Third-party developer, I own it. And it's written there expressly, clear as day. That guy's never going to come out of the woodwork later. You're never going to go to enforce your trade secrets that are embodied in that against, a wrongdoer who stole that stuff, like a company employee who left and started a competing company. If you go to try to enforce that stuff and you can't prove ownership, you might not have a case. Okay, so ownership is a very important thing, and it's so easy to cover too. It's form language. And it's just something that you just don't want to neglect. So minimum effort, huge output. I mean, it's the one thing that kills these deals more often than not is we don't even know if these guys own this IP, and that's their key asset. Do we really want to invest millions of dollars in them? Not sure. And so, another thing on the software front as well is open source software. And These days, hardly any code is built from scratch, right? Totally organic. Folks are often Frankensteining together open source software, third-party components, all that stuff. Of course, integrating it in a certain way, adding their own modules, this and that, wherever you fall on the spectrum, but there's almost always somebody else's stuff involved in your software. That's something an investor is going to look at, because they want to make sure you're being compliant with the terms and conditions of those third-party things. And open source software can be especially tricky because some of it's protected by what's copyleft licenses. Think about open source software. The whole point of it is, hey, we're all coming together. We're democratizing software development. Whatever I create, you're allowed to use it, but you got to pass on. You got to pay it forward, right? What if you use somebody's stuff and it says you got to pay it forward and you can't charge for it? Oh my goodness, that might not just be that module of your software, but the whole darn thing. That can be potentially devastating if left unaddressed, and at a minimum costly to deal with, to clean it up, which will almost always be a requirement at the time of an investment or an acquisition. Folks want to make sure that's cleaned up and in place, and it can be costly and time consuming, and it can wreck a deal. So those are some things to pay attention to on the software side. Y'all feel free.
If I may jump in, make one quick comment about industrial espionage and other ways that you cannot even legally protect some of your stuff, especially if you're thinking of international, especially in robotics, AI, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we really have enough time to discuss those issues, but just to say that those are very important issues. Things may be stolen, and one has to really, or even not stolen, maybe you are forced to disclose some things, or maybe the IP regime in a particular country doesn't offer you the protection that you have. All these things need careful thinking through. I think a whole other webinar probably with.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. For sure. I mean, it's a combination of contractual protections and just practical protections, really, with all this software IP. Contractual protections include some, an end user license agreement or some kinds of terms and conditions. Say in there, thou shalt not reverse engineer, thou shalt not share this with anybody other than authorized users. Things like that really lock someone down. That way, if, they do get access, whether they're trying to be a wrongdoer or not, and it suddenly ends up in another product, you've got some teeth to say, you got this in an improper way that you agreed not to get it. And that can really go a long way. You can get an injunction. You don't have to go through a ton of court stuff just to get to a place where you're made whole. So the contractual protections, I think, are extremely important. And, they apply to data as well. I mean, these days, collecting so much data from connected devices, whether they're wearables or what have you. I mean, that's the lifeblood of innovation in this space in a lot of ways. I understand how my customers are using something. I understand where my functionality is not quite as strong as it should be, and you improve it. And that valuable data is stuff you try to keep close to your vest and keep internal, but it's something worth protecting as well. So on the practical side, need to know access, right? Use your IT stuff. Get, folks, read-only access. Get folks blocked if they're not supposed to be looking at source code. Get notifications if someone accesses source code. Things like that. And of course, just have NDAs in place. I mean, even with your own internal employees, confidentiality agreements and things like that is real important. And then, oftentimes there's a lot of partnerships that get formed where data is created and folks got to figure out who can use it and who can use it for what. And it's something that hardly ever gets addressed up front. So when you start asking those questions, you're like, well, wait a second, this should be mine. I don't want this guy using this in this way because that could compete with me or spill the beans or take away my competitive edge, things like that. And so those things should be banged out in a contract in advance. An ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure type stuff.
Yeah, and one thing is also for software, going back to kind of patent protection, you have to think about it. Sometimes it's possible to kind of protect the software indirectly. What I mean is sometimes, you have some kind of algorithm or some kind of process that your robot follows, but you have to think about like, are there any mechanical features that enable this, the robot to perform that? And that's something you can kind of tie together with the software. Yes, you have your algorithm, and maybe by itself it's not protected, but you had to build this robot, you had to design it so it can actually perform the algorithm. And maybe there's only so many options that, and if you protect kind of that mechanical design, even if somebody can copy the algorithm, maybe perform the steps, they won't be able to actually perform it. Their commercial device won't be, because now you have the protection for the mechanical kind of how you enable the robot to perform the algorithm. So it's also something to kind of, it might not necessarily, obviously you need to protect your software, but it's another creative way of thinking. How can we protect the kind of the overall design? You're not protecting the software directly, but you are protecting your process indirectly by looking at it from kind of more mechanical viewpoint.
One summary point that I wanted to make, that Todd, you hit the nail on the head in Roman, adding in the mechanical aspects. IP doesn't just mean patents, and I think every time people hear IP, they say patents. It's not. I mean, there's process know-how. There's things that are really important and can be the lifeblood of a company, and I've seen it not just at Clarivate, but by the other investments that I've made over the years. Keeping that, and software is a particularly important one, keeping that close to the vest and the practical implications of good contracts. Todd, you hit it on, the basics of your general counsel, and making sure that you have protection in place. And sometimes you have to be able to say no. Even if you have all of the contractual obligations in place, even if you have the patents written, you have all of those things, going, and I've seen this with another portfolio company where litigation sunk the company, and they were on the winning side of it. It still sunk an early stage company. And so you have to be mindful and cognizant of that in everything that you disclose, and to whom, and making sure that you document, because you can do all the right things and still sort of lose in the end. But if you take the really practical steps along with the patents, I think you can try to minimize the risk as best you can.
Great. Well, I think we are actually right up on time. I want to say thank you to all of our outstanding panelists, Dave, for putting this together, and for all of you for contributing to this conversation. It was definitely something that I learned a lot from. And I would like to say thank you to everyone joining us for another program. There will be a recording of this that we will send out, and make sure that you have a copy of. And if there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But I will say thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.